Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and organize around the eco-socialist program that we ran on. So what's going on? Palestine is still top of our concerns, I think. Trump has a plan that Hamas has partially said yes to, including releasing all the hostages. But Israel continues its airstrikes. Trump said, stop them so we can get the hostages out. We'll see if Israel does that, but I'm not confident. And then we've had no news regarding the Uniting for Peace resolution to authorize a protection force to break the blockade, get humanitarian aid into Gaza, and protect the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Colombia's President Gustavo Petro called for that in his UN speech last week and is said to have a resolution for the UN General Assembly ready. But there's no news on when or even if that is coming that I could find. Meanwhile, we have the so-called New York resolution that passed the General Assembly earlier last month by a vote of 142 in favor, 10 opposed, and 12 abstentions. And it was presented as a roadmap for a two-state solution and calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, release of all the hostages, establishment of a Palestinian state, disarmament of Hamas and its exclusion from governance in Gaza, normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab countries, and then a stabilization force to guarantee this plan is implemented. But the problem is there has to be an agreement before that stabilization force goes in, and Israel's never going to agree to that. So this New York resolution is posturing, and while the genocide continues. So the protection force that Petro and others are talking about would go in now to stop the genocide. And I also think in that New York resolution, excluding Hamas from a Palestinian government is just a stupid idea. I mean, Hamas is an authoritarian, theocratic, pro-capitalist, and very socially reactionary political force. But it does have some support among the Palestinians, particularly because of its armed resistance to Israeli oppression. And banning it is just anti-democratic and would undermine the legitimacy of an elected government for many Palestinians. So if Hamas is not given a democratic path, it would be left with no option but more terrorism. Excluding them is just stupid because it's just going to make it harder to get a viable Palestinian government set up. But the makeup of that Palestinian government should be determined by the Palestinian people in elections with full proportional representation. Polling for years has shown that both Hamas and Fatah, the major force in the Palestinian Authority, have minority support. And I remember soon after October 7th, Mustafa Barghouti, who is head of the Palestinian National Initiative, he came in second for president in those elections way back in 2006. And he said, we need elections so we have a Palestinian Authority that's legitimate in the eyes of both the Palestinian people and the international community, and therefore a legitimate negotiator toward a solution, two-state, one-state, confederation, whatever it is. But proportional representation is key. Hamas's plurality in the 2006 elections was more a vote against Fatah and the Palestinian Authority in their corruption and collaboration with the Israeli occupation than it was for the politics of Hamas. That's what the polling shows. But that plurality vote they got was magnified into a majority in the Palestinian Council because of the single-member winner-take-all districts. That election was half districts and half proportional. So Hamas's plurality support got inflated into a pretty narrow majority. In any case, if they ban Hamas, Islamist politics will still find expression if there's elections in a new party. So that seems to me to just not be a smart part of that New York resolution, I mean, even if it's going to be implemented at all, because it wouldn't go into effect until there was an agreement, basically. So it's talking, not doing. And then we have to say the odds of the UN General Assembly adopting a Uniting for Peace resolution for a protection force to intervene right now seems very low. It's not like countries were jumping up to join Petro's call for a liberation army to end the genocide. So what that leaves us here in the United States is we have to continue pushing for an arms embargo, enforced by Congress. And there's a bill, I've talked about it before, HR 3565. We should put that in the chat. And one thing to say is the sponsorship has grown from 22 when it was first introduced in May to 55 by the end of September. So that's some progress. Now, to actually get a vote on it would take a discharge petition, which would require 218 House members, because Speaker Johnson's never going to put it on the floor. We should push for that, but it's probably not going to happen because we're not going to get all the Democrats. But one way or another, we need to get our representatives in our districts on the record on this bill so we can make it an issue in the midterms next year. I mean, to me, that seems like the most practical, immediate thing we can do. And it's just sad that it can't impact what's going on now. So that's the situation in Palestine. It's just heart-wrenching. And then following up on the multipolarity versus antipolarity discussion we had with Patrick Bond a couple of weeks ago, there was something else about Petro's UN speech and then his announcements at a meeting of his Council of Ministers this last week. What Petro seemed to be advancing was antipolar as opposed to multipolar, similar to what Patrick Bond was talking about. And we'll put Patrick's article up again that I put up a couple times. If you haven't read it, I urge you to. And what we're talking about is instead of a multipolar, which is to say multi-imperialist world, with great powers having spheres of influence that dominate smaller powers in those spheres of influence, we should work toward an antipolar world where all states are free of foreign domination. So they're not poles, they're just states out there equal. And then Petro seemed to advance a non-aligned left internationalism in his speech with his condemnation of Stalin's counter-revolutionary actions against the Spanish Revolution, which was 1936 to 39, and against the Greek Revolution, which was 1946 to 49, as well as against the neoliberal imperialism of the West. And I'm going to quote what he said in that part of the speech to the UN. He said, socialism was supposed to be global, but Stalin and Yalta condemned a global revolution that was occurring in Spain and in Greece, and it might have occurred in Latin America and other places. Now, Yalta is where Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt kind of carved up spheres of influence for the post-World War II world. And then Petro continued, so humanity is a new political subject that is emerging rather than the nation state. And this is part of a critique of the United Nations. He goes on, the United Nations has to become a united humanity, diverse but united. This is very important. We have to overcome the idea of the nation state and convert to becoming humanity. But that humanity must be united. For that, there needs to be democracy around the world and permanent dialogue amid diversity. It is our differences that compel us to coordinate our action at the global level. Dialogue, yes. Humanity, yes. Humanity profoundly democratic, yes. So that's the quote. And I think what he's talking about is we should rely on democratic movements from below, not nation states or blocks of nation states, to solve the problems we face. And that's, what Patrick Bond was talking about, the independent left as opposed to the social democratic left, which sort of relies on these institutions, or the multipolar left, which, wants the rise of other powers to compete with the U.S. imperialism or the Western imperialism. We need a non-polar or anti-polar world. And then Petro followed up that September 24 UN speech with a September 29 meeting with Colombia's Council of Ministers. And he announced that Colombia would be ending its status as a NATO global partner, which was set up by the previous administration. So he's getting out of that block. And then he went on to say, rejecting BRICS, quote, I am not going to be in BRICS either because BRICS are oil driven, end of quote. There's a lot more to say about BRICS, and we talked about that with Patrick Bond. But it seems to me that Petro's giving voice to the kind of independent anti-polar left politics that we were talking about. And it's like what Bond, who wrote in this article, which we were putting up in the chat, he says, quote, fully conscious of the geopolitical imperative to oppose Western imperialism, many activists are engaged in non-polar social struggles, find themselves often arrayed against both major blocs within the G20, the G7, and the BRICS. Activists instead regularly demand the kinds of economic, social, and environmentally just policies and practices associated with the liberatory, post-capitalist, anti-racist, feminist, and ecologically sound left-wing values that tend to be either ignored or repressed in both the G7 and the BRICS, end of quote. So I emphasize that because, people kind of think this multipolar idea, which is being pushed by other big powers like Russia and China, will get us to where we need to be. And I'm afraid it's going to give us is a multi-imperialist world. And, where does that lead? Conflict and wars. We need an anti-polar or non-polar world. So let's update on Ukraine too. Trump's turnaround, he called the Russian military a paper tiger and said that Ukraine could win back its territory with EU help. That got some policy change to back it up this week. Although we learned this week, even before Trump posted that Truth Social statement, the U.S. had decided to give Ukraine intelligence needed for bombing Russian military assets and oil refineries deep inside Russia. That's a big change. Under Biden, they never did that, except for the last few months. He shared the intelligence and allowed U.S. weapons to be used in bombing in the Kursk Oblast, which borders Ukraine, which Ukraine had partially occupied. But it wasn't sharing, the Biden administration never shared intelligence on the Russian military assets deeper inside Russia. So Trump is going further than Biden did in that regard. But on the other hand, Trump is undermining U.S. sanctions on Russia. He's stopped all U.S. humanitarian, economic, and military aid. And just to talk about the humanitarian aid, that was through U.S. aid. I mean, HIV/AIDS medicines is a big deal. And so people in Ukraine are not getting them. And there are other things. I mean, the cutoff of that foreign aid, is killing people. And we understand that sometimes CIA operations were embedded in U.S. aid, and that was wrong. But there was a lot of real aid being given, and now Trump has cut that all off. So no humanitarian, economic, or military aid. The U.S. will sell some weapons, not all weapons, to Ukraine if NATO countries are paying for it and giving those weapons to Ukraine. And the Trump administration has even hinted at selling long-range missiles like the Tomahawk, although that is set up to be launched from ships, which Ukraine can't do. So, it's a question of what platform they will use to launch. There are ground launching platforms. There are a few of them. They aren't built, and they'd have to be built to send to Ukraine. So we're not sure completely what that means. But what does it mean that Trump is, giving this intelligence to the Ukrainians? A lot of military analysts think U.S. intelligence is telling the Trump administration that Russia's economy and military positions are weakening. And we do know that Ukrainian drone strikes on Russia's oil refineries have shut down nearly 40% of its oil refining capacity. That was reported just a few days ago, October 1st, in the pro-government Russian business daily Kommersant. So, this is having a real impact, these Ukrainian quote-unquote sanctions on Russian oil. And so, as a consequence, Russia is now preparing to import gasoline from China and South Korea and other Asian countries to offset the growing domestic fuel shortage. And so, what's Trump doing? I think he's a guy that likes to back winners. So I think he's spreading his bets. Some intelligence for Ukraine, some sanctions relief for Russia, and let him fight it out for now. And Trump probably wants to, he's pissed at Putin for not accepting his peace plan, the land for peace deal that was very favorable to Russia and would have kept Ukraine out of NATO or any kind of military alliance or military aid. And but Putin told him no. So I think Trump's a little upset about that. And I think Trump felt he was being played. So, I think he's playing both sides of the street, spreading his bets. Ukraine, by the way, is diversifying its satellite intelligence to European and Japanese satellites, although it's not up to the quality of what the Americans can provide. And then the other interesting thing with regard to Ukraine is Zelensky's speech to the UN. He scolded it for failing to stop the wars, not only in Ukraine, but in Gaza, Somalia, and Sudan. And he scolded the West for refusing to offer reliable security guarantees in the peace deal to Ukraine. And that was very interesting because it kind of cut against, the U.S., which is, deeply involved in Somalia and Gaza. And Zelensky said, Ukraine can only count on weapons and friends for its security. So it's a move toward more self-reliance and working with allies who actually help Ukraine. That was something of a change of posture. He wasn't buttering up the Trump people so much. So that continues and with no end in sight, although it's really a stalemate. And, we'll see if Ukraine does get those long-range missiles from the U.S. It's building its own. It's got a long-range cruise missile that's about to be deployed. So it may be able to, as it has with drones, be able to make those deep strikes on its own. And it's having an impact on the battlefield. So then we had Trump and Hegseth at Quantico this week giving their bullshit speeches. Hegseth, wants to resume bullying and hazing of recruits. He said no politically correct rules of engagement. And he said General Patton is the model. It was that politically correct General Dwight D. Eisenhower who relieved Patton of his duty for slapping around soldiers who had PTSD. They didn't call it back then. Call it that back then. So, this is really a recipe or permission for war crimes like the U.S. did at Abu Ghraib in Iraq. It's a bad, omen. Although the generals met that with stony silence, I don't think they're buying what Hegseth is selling, because Hegseth, is a former Marine who was involved in journalism who became a Fox News presenter, and that's why Trump made him Secretary of Defense, or what they want to call Secretary of War. And then Trump, spoke after that, and he said, we're at war with the enemy within, the enemy at home. And he talked about U.S. inner cities being battlegrounds. And inner cities is a code for Blacks and Latinos. And he said they should be training grounds for U.S. troops. So he's basically declaring war with most of the multicultural American population. And we really saw this in Chicago Wednesday night You probably saw something about this. ICE, Border Patrol, FBI, and ATF agents invaded a south side of Chicago apartment building in the middle of the night and terrorized its Black and Latino residents. ICE agents and other parts of this interagency task force rappelled from Black Hawk helicopters onto the roof of the apartment building. They used flash bang grenades to scare the hell out of people. It was a military operation with these agents wearing masks, military helmets, and bulletproof vests. And they took the children and they zip tied them together and separated them from their parents. And one resident, and we'll put some reports in the chat on this, complained that she complained about it to the ICE agent who told her, "Fuck them kids." I mean, that's the attitude of these goons that they're sending in there. They kicked in doors, they blew off doors with explosives, they broke windows, and they trashed people's apartments and destroyed their property. All their stuff is out in the halls, all over the floors of their apartment buildings. They used a chainsaw to cut through fencing. They blew holes in the walls. In the end, they grabbed 37 people who are immigrants. It's unclear whether they are legal or undocumented, but I haven't been able to find much follow-up in the mainstream media. But, look at the video from ABC 7 Chicago. They interviewed the woman that talked about the zip-tied kids. And the article from the Atlanta Black Star. The black press is on this story, while the mainstream media seems to have immediately moved on. And there's good reason to believe this was about more than immigration enforcement or policing. And it was about the state on behalf of real estate interests in Chicago, and Trump and his people are real estate people, using military operations to criminalize, condemn, and gentrify a working class neighborhood. See the article that we'll put in the chat from Dr. Stacy Patton, which appeared in the Black publication News One, that explores that angle. So the Trump regime has declared war on what he calls the lunatic radical left, by which he means the Democrats primarily, so that the Republicans can stay in power. But they're also going after those of us in the social movements on the independent left too, particularly if we're out there protesting these atrocities by ICE and the other federal agencies coming out after immigrants. And what happened in Chicago and is happening in cities across the country, that's what fascism looks like. They're declaring war on cities, they're declaring cities war zones, and protesters as terrorists in order to demonize and dehumanize us and make it easier for us to be repressed. And this is not going to stop until we stop it ourselves with mass resistance in the streets, in the courts, speaking out with our own voices, in elections, in order to delegitimize and disempower these fascists. The Trump regime has also declared war on so-called narco-terrorists, and by which they mean immigrants mainly from South America and the Caribbean. The murder of young people in boats off the coast of Venezuela is the most obvious case of this. 21 people have been murdered so far, with another boat bombed yesterday. Petro said in his speech at the UN, these were migrants fleeing poverty, and some were Colombian. This is totally in violation of international law. In the past, if the U.S. thought somebody's bringing drugs to the U.S., the Coast Guard would have the boat stopped, they'd board it, and they'd investigate. These were summary executions, murder, cold-blooded murder. And as Petro said, U.S. officials, including Trump, should have criminal cases opened against them for these murders. We have violent fascists in charge of the U.S. government, and the time to resist is now. And finally, just a word about the federal government shutdown. This is a real problem. The Trump regime is trying to use it to permanently cut federal public services and lay off thousands of public employees. And restoring those services is going to be difficult if the Democrats come back into power as the alternative to the Trumplicans. Cuts to federal programs and cuts to taxes on the rich have been bipartisan since the Carter administration. The Reagan tax and cuts and service cuts were passed by Democratic majorities in the House and Senate. The Clinton-Gingrich service cuts were bipartisan. You know, the end of welfare as we know it, and NAFTA, and the Telecommunications Act, all that negative reactionary legislation was bipartisan. And then the Bush tax and service cuts were not repealed when Obama and the Democrats got congressional majorities during Obama's first 2 years. And then the Trump tax and service cuts of his first term were not repealed when Biden and the Democrats had congressional majorities in Biden's first 2 years. So we have to realize the Democrats represent their super rich donors and the professional upper middle class cadre that are their politicians, political operatives, lawyers, and NGO operators. It's going to restore these services, restore more progressive taxation. You know, that's why we need the Green Party. And we need to get serious and systematic about getting into power, not just being a protest vote. So I'm going to stop there and see what you have to say. Questions and comments. Scout Trooper 164. Howie, I have a feeling the police are finally getting fed up with ICE, and this may lead to civil war. Trump is asking for besides the government shutdown to blame Democrats. The police chief, who I believe is from Chicago, is stating that criminal investigations into ICE are now being formed, indicating that they are seeing ICE and other National Guards as hostile. If Trump does go through with this, do you think this will be in favor of him or perhaps in favor of the blue states, depending on supplies and tactics? So this was divided into three parts. The second part, I think he said that the Chicago police chief is looking into investigating ICE criminal violations. Well, I hope so. I know the mayor doesn't want ICE in there, although he's had a rough relationship with the Chicago police. So I'm not sure about that. I think it depends on the city. I know my city of Syracuse, the police do not want to cooperate with ICE, and they don't. Although the county sheriff said he doesn't, but apparently is. That's with respect to when ICE wants to take people who are in the county jail, the sheriff will not cooperate unless they have a court-ordered warrant. But then you go outside of the county around Syracuse, which is Onondaga County, and sheriff's departments and police are cooperating. I think I mentioned on this podcast a raid of a nutrition bar factory, 220 employees. I snatched 70 of them. They wouldn't even let the owners back in. They racially profiled the employees and grabbed all the Latinos and separated them. And those who didn't have all their documentation with them were detained and sent all over to all these detention centers around the country. There's some pregnant women there. There's some women with babies who are still nursing. It was, and that's still playing itself out. So, and you read these reports, from all over the country. It's so I think it depends on the city, whether the police are cooperating with ICE and the Border Patrol and those others. We're within Border Patrol's jurisdiction in Syracuse because we're less than, I forget the amount of miles, 100 miles from the Canadian border. So Border Patrol's running around here too. Now, the Civil War question, I think, Trump is relying on these federal agencies like ICE, Border Patrol, which are, those officers tend to be very conservative. You may remember the Border Patrol coming to a rally at the White House in the 2020 campaign, which is totally illegal against the Hatch Act, but they did it and there was no consequences. They are more politically loyal to Trump than the military, which still prides itself on being loyal to the Constitution rather than the president as an individual. And I think, from what I can see, that's still the way most of the military feels about it, but not all of them. I mean, General Flynn, who's now retired and just a blabbermouth on social media, he's calling for implementing the Insurrection Act and, doing a whole lot of other crazy stuff. At least from what I can see, the military officers are not down with that. Although there's a division. Seymour Hersh, maybe 15 years ago, said there was a division between, he called them the Rocks and the Crusaders. The Crusaders were these Christian warriors who wanted to go on a holy war against Islam in the Middle East. And the Rocks were more the, military people who said, we got to uphold the Constitution. And we're about defending the country, not just running around the world creating chaos. And sort of most of the Rocks were disproportionately black officers. And one of them was in this analysis, Colin Powell, who, was not enthusiastic about intervening in Iraq. He said, if we break it, we own it, or we pay for it. And on the other hand, he did present that phony intelligence data to the UN to justify the invasion. So I guess what I'm saying to say all that is that I think within the military, there are different tendencies. I don't see a civil war between, the police and the military or anything like that at this point. But, the core of the Trump people are the core of the political trend and his tradition in our country that started the damn Civil War. They're traitors to the idea of an American democracy. And they're still around, and racism is their common denominator. And those people are looking for a fight. So, I wouldn't rule out anything, but I think at this point, I don't see the police and the military coming to blows. At war with us, do you think anti-corruption should feature more prominently in Green Party messaging, considering that the Republicans and Democrats lack credibility on this issue? Yeah, I know it. I've used it effectively when I was running against Andrew Cuomo, who famously set up an anti-corruption commission and then shut it down when it started getting close to his office. And I was in a 2014 debate, which was set up perfectly to just nail him on that. The Republican would attack him from the right on social policy and other things. And then Trump would speak. And then I'd attack Trump from the left, including on this corruption hypocrisy. At one point he said it's an independent commission. And then when he shut it down, he said, well, it's my commission. I can do what I want with it. I just nailed him on that. Then the next candidate was the libertarian, who was kind of just out on cloud nine. I mean, I don't know what he was talking about, but it wasn't what the other three of us were talking about. So it was Republican hits him from the right, Trump defends himself, I hit him from the left, and he never comes back at me because he gets hit again from the right by the Republican. Anyway, that anti-corruption message struck home, along with some others, the fracking issue and the failure to fund public schools. So we got a lot of public employees backing us. We got the environmental movement, and we got 5% of the vote, which is more than any left party, independent left party, except for the socialists in 1918 and 1920. They got a few tenths of a percent more than me, has gotten. And this, the third party tradition in New York goes back to the anti-slavery Liberty Party in the 1840s. So we got a good result in the corruption issue played with people. People don't want their government to be corrupt. So yeah, I think if you got corruption issues with the people, Democrats and Republicans are running against, you should definitely hammer away at that issue, because people want good, honest government, ideology aside. Vicky Corden. Trump does not care about international law. That is one reason those people were killed in their boats. Maybe they were fishing or were immigrants. What is the proof that they had illegal stuff? Yeah, there is none. And the administration hasn't provided it. They're just asserting they were quote unquote narco terrorists. Okay, so arrest them and put them on trial. Don't just murder them. Yeah, you're right. Trump doesn't care about international law. If he did, Putin would have been arrested when he got to Alaska and sent to The Hague, because the International Criminal Court has a warrant out for his arrest for abducting children from Ukraine to Russia. And Netanyahu, when he was in the White House, they could put handcuffs on him there and send him to The Hague, because he's under a arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court for the genocide in Gaza. So, yeah, Trump, international law, and that gets back to the multipolar question. Some of the people that promote multipolarity, like John Mearsheimer, they say, oh, it's just the way the world is. The big powers have their spheres of influence, and the small powers just have to accept it and try to live with it, and not don't poke the bear, as Mearsheimer has said to the Ukrainians about Russia. And people like Mearsheimer, who's a liberal, he's a Bernie Sanders supporter in domestic politics, but in international politics, he basically says, there are big powers, there's imperialism, deal with it. He doesn't want to, he doesn't believe we can have an alternative to that. If we are going to have an alternative, we need international law, and we need, starting with the United States, to have big powers agree to abide by it. That was the whole idea of the United Nations. In the aftermath of the horrors of World War II, the millions of people killed, the Holocaust and all that. And that's how we got the UN Charter. That's how we got the International Declaration of Human Rights. That's how we got the Geneva Convention Against Genocide. And those are important. If we don't abide by them, and the U.S. should set an example on that, then we got a world of a war of each against all, and real live wars. So yeah, international law. The Green Party platform says we believe in human rights and international law, and we should. And yeah, Trump is he doesn't care about international. He doesn't care about domestic law. I mean, I'm just thinking, they got Bolsonaro for fomenting an insurrection, trying to overturn an election. Trump tried to do that. He got elected president. And Merrick Garland, who Biden appointed, dillied and dallied around until, Trump was able to outlast it, and he got reelected, and now he's immune from prosecution as long as he's in office. So, yeah, I mean, ironically, we should be for law and order, real law and order, not the, repressive law and order that, people like Nixon and Trump talk about. Strong Flower. I honestly still can't believe that we're now living in a country where so many of the masses are in support of genocide in Palestine at this point. More pressure should be placed on this issue socially. Yeah, there's still a lot of support for Israel and excuses for what it's doing in Gaza. But the fact is, the majority of Americans are opposed. I mean, the polling that we've had, just take on the question of arms embargo of Israel. Even, I forget the exact date now, but a few weeks after October 7th, and then the mass destruction in Gaza, a majority, I think it was 51%, 52%, were for an arms embargo of Israel. And then by the following April, and I think again in June of 2024, it was 60% and 62%, something like that. And then there was no polling during the election, but there was recent polling. And I forget the number that came out, but it's grown again. Americans don't want to be giving Israel bombs to blast Palestinians to kingdom come. And so I would take heart from that. And now what we got to do is turn that public opinion into public policy. That's why I brought up HR 3565. I think Congress is the lever. If Congress would authorize it and force Trump's hand, or whoever is the president, when we finally get something like that passed, there's the bill again. That's what we need to be doing. And, we should be confident because we got the American people with us, a majority. Now we got to get the damn members of the House and Senate. We got to make it cost them politically to refrain from passing this arms embargo. And, that, like I said, we got to get them on the record now, even if it's not a vote in the House, it's a statement they make in a forum we set up, or, we get our journalist friends to ask and get them on the record so we can make it an issue in the midterms next year. Scout Trooper 164. When it comes to Ukraine, what do you think of Russia being forced to import from countries like China for gasoline? It's hilariously ironic that the giant gas station now has to import oil and gas now. Yeah, that's what I was talking about earlier. Ukrainian oil and gas sanctions, which are primarily bombing their oil refineries, but also their pipelines and other parts of that oil and gas infrastructure, are having a real impact. The figure I cited, which came from a Russian business publication, Kommersant, says that Russia's oil refining capacity is down 40%. So they're still exporting crude, but then they got to re-import it as refined gasoline from countries like China. That's what they're trying to do. So, in a way that shows, Trump said Ukraine has no cards to play. Well, they played this card, and it even got Trump's attention, I think. So, hopefully those sanctions will continue to get stronger. And, the EU countries are starting to pay more attention to the shadow fleet of unregistered ships that are carrying, tankers that are carrying Russian crude oil to countries to be refined. Hopefully they'll be putting more emphasis on stopping those. So, yeah, something like 40% of Russia's government revenue comes from oil and gas exports. That's their Achilles heel. It's really important that we keep pushing, and we got to realize that Trump is undermining that. I think I mentioned earlier, but I was on another call I was on. ExxonMobil and Rosneft, the state-owned big oil and gas company in Russia, have signed an agreement to resume their businesses in Russia, which is the oil and gas business. And if that goes through, that's a carbon bomb on the climate, because Russia has a large portion of the world's oil and gas, even in the projects that are already started. If I remember this right, they would, if all that oil and gas and coal is extracted and burned, it would be 82 gigatons, and the world climate budget was 500 gigatons. This was from a few years ago. And then there are a lot more reserves and expected resources, particularly under the Arctic Ocean. So this is an issue for the climate movement, as well as people in solidarity with oppressed nations like Ukraine. So it's an issue we got to bring up. Maybe I'll talk about that more in a future call or have a guest on. I had Svetlana Romanko, who's with Razum We Stand, the Ukraine-based campaign to tighten sanctions on Russia for oil and gas and rebuild Ukraine around renewables and have Ukraine be an inspiration for Europe and the rest of the world for how to get off oil and gas. And I know she was just at the UN when the General Assembly spoke, and they had a climate day. And I just read Bill McKibben's column. He met with her in Rome. She was there for the Pope was reaffirming Pope Leo was reaffirming Pope Francis's commitment to fighting climate change. There's a Latin word for the program. I can't remember what it is right now, but Svetlana's been involved in that. I don't know. She may be Catholic. That's one of the major religions in particularly Western Ukraine where she's from. So, maybe I'll get her back. Or there are a number of people, but this oil and gas issue for Russia it's Achilles' heel, like I said. Vicky Corden, any thoughts about the new anti-terrorist directive, which basically penalizes for not being MAGA? Yeah, that's why I said it's not just us lefties that they're looking at. They're looking at the damn Democratic Party because it doesn't support all of Trump's craziness. And and calling us terrorists is a way to, as I said, dehumanize us and demonize us. So people watching us, get arrested, detained, harassed by the legal system, some people will think, well, we deserved it. Others are just going to lay low saying, well, I'm not directly involved. And if I keep quiet, maybe they'll leave me alone. So it's very dangerous. I mean, they are undermining our basic constitutional rights and trying to intimidate people and, with examples of, prosecution for thought crimes. It's a very dangerous situation. Andrew Hager, any initial thoughts on what Robert Reich and Fair and Balanced are saying about everything that's happening during Trump's second term? I'm not sure who or what Fair and Balanced is. Oh, Fair and Balanced. Is that what he's calling what he's putting out there, Robert Reich? I don't know. But yeah, Reich has been warning about the dangers of the Trump administration and the economic follies of his policies. And I think Reich is pretty good on that. I remember him when we went to the same college, and he came back, and prior to becoming labor secretary under Clinton, he was extolling neoliberalism and free trade and how, we're not going to be doing any more manual work in this country. We'll all be symbolic manipulators. So we'll all be doing paperwork and soon computer work. And when he became labor secretary, he was a little better. And he clashed with Clinton on things like welfare reform. He wrote an interesting, memoir of his time as labor secretary called Locked in the Cabinet, which is kind of a ironic, funny title. So I don't follow him closely, but when stuff comes my way, I take a look, and I'm generally in agreement. But I haven't been following what he's been saying closely, so that's about all I can say. Scout Trooper 164, did you see the pictures of the generals reacting to Hegseth's speech about the military? Kyle Kulinski says they look pissed, disgusted. Yeah, and just a stony silence. Um, in fact, Trump commented on that. He says, "You're not laughing, you're not applauding." And he said, if you don't, he said, loosen up. And then he said, if you don't like it, you can leave. And then he, quote unquote, joked that, but if you do, you might lose your rank. And that actually brought a few nervous chuckles. But yeah, I've looked at those pictures. I looked for those pictures and looked at them. And yeah, the generals, yeah, pissed, disgusted. I think that's accurate. They came all the way from all over the world, 800 of them, and for something that it could have been sent to them on a YouTube video, it was pathetic, on the part of Hegseth and Trump. And I think these military people are thinking, God, if these are the people in charge of us, we're in trouble. Andrew Hager, if Trump is standing in opposition towards the UN, not only do I fear the safety of our country, but the chances of World War III being declared. The 25th Amendment must be ruled in favor immediately. Okay, the 25th Amendment has a procedure for the cabinet to remove the president for being incapacitated and maybe incompetent. I don't remember the exact wording. It was discussed by members of Trump's cabinet during his first administration, but they decided not to do it because it would create a constitutional crisis. And I don't think Trump's going to declare World War III. He likes saying he's the peacemaker. He's going to do undeclared wars like these murders he's committing in the Caribbean, or the bombs he's given to Israel to murder the Palestinians. So I'm not worried about World War III. I think what we're having is hybrid war. What's with all these drones? I mean, they look like they're Russian. Who else would be doing it? They're over Oslo, over Munich, over Denmark, over Poland, in that big bombing of Ukraine, where about 24 drones went into Poland. They had those jets fly over Estonia, and then yesterday, or maybe it was this morning, they were above a Czech airport, and they had to close that down. Last night they had to close down the Munich airport in Germany. And then there's sabotage going on. I was just on a call with European people in solidarity with Ukraine, and they were talking about, all the things going on, in particularly in Poland, but also in Germany. So this is like, the way that the Cold War. This is a Cold War. It's not a hot war between the military forces of the big powers, but it's through proxies and through sort of low-level sabotage. There's a cyber warfare going on. So that, conflict is already going on. And I think, that what it's doing is undermining democracy, because to respond to that, you need stronger security and surveillance to try to prevent it, which militarizes society. I'm talking about the Western societies now. And, one of the things we used to say in the Cold War, to resist Russian, or at that time, Soviet, authoritarianism, we don't want to become like them. But that's what that tends to do. So I'm not worried about, big nuclear war. Intentionally, there's always the possibility of accident, misunderstanding. We've come close a number of times. I mean, the one good thing that seems to be going on right now is Putin has offered to negotiate. He wasn't doing it. Now he's willing to negotiate on New START, which is the strategic arms agreement, and start talking about intermediate range nuclear weapons. The treaty the U.S. pulled out of under Trump, the first Trump, and at John Bolton's urging, and that's why that's where we're in a situation like we were in the 80s during the Euro missiles crisis, when the U.S. put missiles in West Germany and the Soviets responded, and these missiles were just a couple of minutes from each other's side, and at a time of high tensions could have started World War III. That's what led to the big million-strong march for a nuclear freeze here in New York City, and all the demonstrations in Europe, both East and West. And, in the end, we got Gorbachev and Reagan agreeing to some substantial arms reductions. That's what we need to be pursuing. I mean, I've said from the beginning, while we support Ukraine, we should also be very publicly, so the world knows it, telling the Russians we want to negotiate mutual security agreements on both nuclear and conventional arms in Europe, and come up with a trans-European or pan-European security architecture that everybody feels safe in. And I still think that should be the public diplomacy of the United States. I think Putin is not that interested in it right now, although he's shown some indication with these recent offers to negotiate. But if Putin got, those security agreements, and it was, give and take on both sides, then Putin could pull out of Ukraine and say he won. He won the security of Russia. He'd have a political excuse domestically. Unfortunately, I think he's looking for more than security. He's looking to restore the old Russian Empire. It's that Russian, great Russian chauvinism that, Lenin and Trotsky and them warned about when they overthrew the Tsar, that, that can't come back. Scout Trooper 164. I highly doubt Putin will be able to get the oil and gas he's hoping for. Russia is barely buying bonds because they're running out of money. And with them no longer exporting, that's even worse. Yeah, they may be able to import, but it's going to cost them dearly, and it's going to undermine their ability to finance the war. And they've been cutting domestic services for the war, and the Russian people are hurting. Not so much in Moscow and Petersburg, but certainly in the rest of the country, which is very poor. And there are lots of signs of discontent. The problem is for that to come out publicly is very dangerous, because right now the state will lock you up for the slightest expression of dissent. What happened after, during the Afghanistan war was the mothers of the soldiers there were protesting, and it was hard to suppress them. And eventually had an impact, so they finally pulled out. And we do know that the mothers are, protesting. People, they have, bonuses for signing up. They've gone up to the equivalent of $73,000, I think. Yeah, 6 million rubles, $73,000 signing bonus. They've just started in Russia because they're having trouble recruiting people for these meat waves on the front. And but Russians are complaining. Well, my son went and they didn't recover his body, so we can't prove he was killed, so they don't get paid. There's a lot of discontent over that, as well as just problems with services. So, at some point, even in a very repressive society like Russia, that can boil up. But It's hard to predict. Joanna Munley, what are your thoughts on how the U.S. is treating South American countries? Venezuela, Argentina, El Salvador, Brazil. Any thoughts on potential colonialism? Well, Venezuela, they're saying Maduro is a cocaine trafficker. Not a lot of evidence for that. And, they say Venezuela is repressive. Yes, it is. But who do they back? They back these right wingers who, would be just as happy to be repressive. So there's hypocrisy there. Argentina, they just bailed out them, I believe. That's where you got this super libertarian Milei. Is that pronounced? Malou. So they're supporting him. El Salvador, that's where that thug is ruling and, just brutally going after the alleged, drug dealers and gangs and locking them up. Brazil, they put high tariffs on them because Lula's not playing along with U.S. bullying so much. And I think we got to add Colombia to that. Petro gave that speech I talked some points about earlier. And so the U.S. Withdrew his visa. He did go out in the streets and urge U.S. troops and cops not to follow Trump's orders, which was pretty ballsy. In any case, he went back to Colombia, met with his council of ministers and said, we're going to stop being a NATO global partner. It's a certain category of people not in Europe who cooperate with NATO, countries like Australia, New Zealand. I'm trying to remember who else. Colombia was one of them. So he pulled out of that, as well as saying, the BRICS are a bunch of petrostates, and pulled out of that. So I think Colombia could be in the crosshairs of the U.S. in terms of policy. The idea that those troops and that naval armada outside in the southern Caribbean are going to invade Venezuela, I don't think so. I mean, they have 4,000 troops, from what I hear, and you're not going to, stage a coup and install a government in Venezuela with just 4,000 troops. That's even crazier than Putin thinking he could roll over the Ukrainians with 200,000 troops. So I don't think that's happening. But, the mechanisms of neocolonialism are economic more than anything. The debt penury that they've got these countries in through the IMF, the World Bank, the UN climate change policies, the market-based solutions. Who am I leaving out? Oh, and the World Trade Organization. That is, what is exploiting these countries in a colonial way. In other words, we're getting back more money than we invest, and it's impoverishing those countries. So the other thing, America first, in Trump's mind, is like, okay, Russia, you can have Ukraine, but we got the Americas. So they feel like, going back to the Monroe Doctrine, other powers stay out of the Western Hemisphere because that belongs to the U.S., and the U.S. will do what it wants there. In terms of invasions, I'm more worried about Mexico. The Republicans and Trump have talked about that a lot, sending military forces in to go after the drug cartels in Mexico, which is not getting at the root problem. You can't solve problems like that with the military. But that, I think if they do anything like that, Mexico may be the first in line. Okay, time went fast today. Thank you for your questions and comments. I don't have a guest lined up next week, although I was thinking today's the 300th day of protests in Georgia. And the people just will not relent, and the regime is getting more repressive. So I think I'm going to write to our friend in Georgia and see if he wants to come on and give us an up-to-date report. I do have an Iranian American leftist, Frida Afari, coming on in early October. So we'll have some more guests, but there's plenty of news to talk about. So next week we'll probably have questions and answers, unless our Georgia friend wants to come on right away. In the meantime, like I've been saying, stay active. What we do makes a difference, and you're going to feel a lot better about things if you're working together with people rather than just being isolated by yourself and reading the bad news on these screens. So everybody, have a good week, and we'll see you next week.